Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to being well informed. Today we're taking a deep dive into something called prescription drug monitoring programs, or PDMPs.
Right.
They're really the main systemic tool that's been designed to fight the opioid crisis in America. But, to really understand the policy, I think we have to start with the human cost that sparked it.
And that cost was thrown into the public eye in a huge way on January 22, 2008. The actor Heath Ledger, who's only 28, was found dead in his apartment in New York City.
And the cause of death was just shocking. It was ruled an accidental poisoning.
An acute intoxication from just a whole cocktail of legally prescribed drugs.
A lethal mix. But what's really striking when you look at it is the sheer number of different central nervous system depressants. This wasn't just one drug. It was painkillers, anti-anxiety meds, and sleep aids all at once.
Exactly. And Ledger's death, as high profile as it was, it really became a kind of flashpoint for a public health crisis that officials were already starting to call the new epidemic.
An epidemic that was proving to be even deadlier than the heroin and crack crises from, decades before.
So our mission today is to really track the history of the PDMP. It's a policy that feels very modern, very digital, but it actually has these surprising roots that go back over a century.
And we're going to need to analyze the conflicting scientific evidence about whether it even works, whether it actually reduces overdose deaths.
And ultimately, we have to understand the policy paradox here. Why did PDMPs become this universally embraced solution, even with all this scientific skepticism about their actual impact on public health?
Okay, so let's unpack that history. When we say prescription drug monitoring program, what are we actually talking about?
There's about state-level databases. And these databases, they track every single prescription written for controlled substances.
The goal being, I assume, to stop doctor shopping.
That's the main idea, yes.
Yeah.
Preventing patients from getting the same prescription from multiple doctors and just generally making the act of prescribing safer for everyone involved.
So what's so fascinating is you said this idea isn't new. I mean, it sounds like a product of the digital age.
Not at all. The very first documented attempt in the U.S. was in New York State, way back in 1914.
For 1914.
In 1914, under something called the Boylan Act. It was a paper system. Doctors had to submit, duplicate prescription forms for opiates to a state database.
That's incredible. So what happened to it? I mean, why isn't it still around?
Well, it was incredibly short-lived. It was completely gone within 3 years by 1917.
So why did it fail so quickly?
Because restricting the legal supply created unintended consequences almost immediately.
Huh.
The legal supply was now controlled, but the demand, it stayed the same. And this led to diversion, to a rise in illicit markets, and a public backlash that the system was just pushing people into the shadows.
That sounds eerily familiar, a direct echo of the debates we are having right now.
It is. But the legal foundation for the modern PDMP, that was laid much, much later. In 1977, with the Supreme Court case, Wayland v. Roe.
Okay, so what was that case about?
Well, New York had an updated PDMP system by then, and it was challenged by patients and doctors. They argued that forcing the state to record patient names and addresses for Schedule II drugs was a violation of privacy under the 14th Amendment.
And how did the Supreme Court see it? How did they define the state's right to collect all that specific medical data?
They ultimately ruled that this administrative requirement to record patient IDs was permissible. But the key takeaway, the part of the ruling that still defines these programs today.
Yes.
The Supreme Court defined the PDMP primarily as a state law enforcement tool.
Not a public health tool.
No. Its purpose was for preventing unlawful diversion. It wasn't defined as an instrument of medicine. And that dual identity, a medical guide on one hand and an instrument of police power on the other, that is baked into its DNA.
That legal view is so critical, especially when you think about how technology changed everything. I mean, in 1977, you're talking about paper forms, mail, weeks of lag time.
It was essentially a paper archive, only really useful for, looking back at things, for audits. But then the internet comes along in the 1990s and just fundamentally revolutionizes the whole concept.
Right.
Oklahoma set up the first fully electronic program in 1990, and suddenly data transmission could be fast, routine, scalable.
And this digital revolution, it happened to coincide with two massive shifts in medicine, didn't it?
Absolutely. A perfect storm. First, you had the medical community pushing for what they called aggressive pain management.
This is when pain was labeled the fifth vital sign.
The fifth vital sign, exactly. The idea that it had to be managed just as intensely as your blood pressure. And second, you had pharmaceutical companies aggressively marketing new opioids like OxyContin and telling doctors the addiction risk was minimal.
So we had this massive explosion in legal opioid prescribing right at the moment the technology to monitor it all became easy and fast.
Precisely. And the expansion was just dramatic. 27 new programs came online just between 2000 and 2009.
And where are we today?
Today, PDMPs are nearly universal. 49 states, D.C., Guam, Puerto Rico, they all have one.
Only one state without one.
Just Missouri. And even there, St. Louis runs its own local version, so adoption is near total.
And the role has changed too, right? They're not just passive record-keeping systems anymore.
No, not at all. Now they're what we call point-of-care tools.
Hmm.
Many states actually mandate that prescribers must query the database before they write an opioid prescription.
So they have to look up the patient's history first.
They have to. That's the public health application in action. But, and this is important, we can't forget that legal definition from Whalen v. Roe.
The law enforcement tool.
Exactly. While everyone talks about public health, state and local law enforcement still actively access these records. They surveil patients, and they surveil prescribers they think might be running pill mills.
So you have this huge administrative push, massive federal funding mandates, which brings us to the real question. Does all of this surveillance actually, solve the problem? Does it stop people from dying?
That is the absolute core of the tension here. I mean, on a purely mechanical level, the PDMPs work exactly as they're designed to.
How so?
Well, studies confirm they do reduce opioid prescribing rates. They reduce the average dose, especially in states where checking the system is mandatory. The policy successfully restricts the legal supply.
Okay, so if the legal supply goes down, why isn't that a clear win for public health? I mean, what are we missing when we look at the mortality numbers?
We're missing the reality of addiction, the demand side of the equation.
Oh.
A real public health success has to be measured by a drop in overall overdose deaths. And on that front, the evidence is, well, it's disappointingly mixed.
What does that mean, mixed?
Well, take a key study from 2011. It found that states with PDMPs did, in fact, have lower prescribing rates, but they did not have significantly lower overall rates of opioid overdose deaths compared to states without them.
So the death rate stays high even when the number of legal pills goes down. That suggests people are just finding other sources.
Exactly. It's redirection, not resolution. Research strongly suggests that when you clamp down on the supply of prescription pills, you do reduce prescription pill deaths, but you risk this deadly substitution effect.
People who are dependent just turn to the illicit market.
They do. And today, the illicit market means heroin and increasingly fentanyl.
Which is infinitely more dangerous.
Infinitely. So you see a rise in heroin and fentanyl deaths that basically cancels out any gains you made on the prescription side. And to make it even more dangerous, the risk of a fatal overdose actually spikes after any period where access is restricted.
Why is that?
Because your tolerance drops. So forcing a sudden stop without treatment is incredibly hazardous.
So this brings that policy paradox into really sharp focus. Why do policymakers keep pouring billions into these programs if the outcomes are so mixed and sometimes even dangerous?
Because PDMPs are, politically speaking, very safe.
Safe.
They're an easy, expedient solution that makes it look like you're being tough on the problem. They target bad actors, the pill mill doctors, the doctor shoppers, and they produce all this data that gives the illusion of control.
So they're treating the symptom, which is too many pills.
Instead of the cause, which is addiction, it's the supply-side administrative control.
Right.
It lets everyone avoid the much more complex, much more politically difficult conversations about what addiction actually is, like chronic disease, and what it would take to actually treat it.
So let's circle back to the crisis that really put all this in the spotlight, Heath Ledger's struggle. When you look at the specific drugs found in his system, that cocktail, it perfectly illustrates the danger here.
It illustrates the danger of polypharmacy. That's the term for using multiple different drugs at the same time, often from different doctors, with no one person managing the combined risk.
And the overdose was ruled accidental because it wasn't one single pill. It was the combined effects of all of them.
Exactly. The painkillers, the sleep aids, the anti-anxiety meds, they all work together to suppress his respiratory system.
And it's so important to remember his struggle wasn't just about physical pain. His documented issues were things like intense anxiety and severe chronic insomnia.
That's right. In an interview in 2007, he talked about it. He said he was sleeping, on average, just 2 hours a night because his mind was always racing. He even said that one Ambien didn't work, and taking two just left him in a stupor. He was trying to self-medicate for some very real mental distress.
And when you break down the prescriptions, 3 of the 6 drugs in his system were benzodiazepines. Diazepam, temazepam, and alprazolam. That's three different drugs from the same high-risk class.
That's a critical detail, because benzodiazepine abuse is its own growing public health crisis. Overdoses involving benzos are actually increasing faster than the number of prescriptions being written for them,
Which suggests people are escalating their use.
or combining them dangerously. And these drugs, they carry serious warnings for adverse reactions like agitation, confusion, even suicidal ideation.
And after his death, Ledger's own family drew a direct line from this personal tragedy to the need for a policy solution.
They did. His father, Kim Ledger, he publicly called for tighter rules, for governments to implement real-time monitoring systems for prescription drugs. It was the personal story reinforcing that demand for oversight.
And that call for real-time monitoring is essentially a call for a fully realized, effective PDMP, one that could, in theory, prevent doctors from simultaneously prescribing dangerous combinations.
Yes, a system that would stop different providers from unknowingly contributing to the same lethal cocktail.
So, to summarize our deep dive here, PDMPs have been on this century-long journey. They started as this narrow, paper-based enforcement tool.
Then got defined by the Supreme Court as an instrument of police power, and now they've become this almost universal digital response to the crisis.
And they're very effective at one thing,
Right.
reducing the supply of prescription opioids.
But their ability to reduce overall overdose deaths is highly controversial. At worst, they might just be pushing the problem into the much riskier illicit market.
The political and financial support for them just keeps growing, though, because they offer this administratively clean supply-side fix.
But if we look back at what was driving Ledger's drug use, that intense anxiety, the chronic insomnia, his was a battle of demand.
And that raises a really important final question for you, the listener, to think about as you process all of this. We know from study after study that demand-side interventions like talk therapy, specifically cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, are considered the first-line, most effective long-term treatment for conditions like chronic anxiety and insomnia.
So when policy focuses so heavily on administrative control and surveillance, on PDMPs, what are the broader societal risks when we consistently underprioritize funding and access to these proven but politically complex treatments that actually address the root causes of substance use disorder?